Hail and well met. I'm your humble storyteller, Kenneth, and today I will give you guys my tips on being a great dungeon master. Some of you may already use these tips already, and others may not be. Either way, for dungeon masters both old and new, I hope this video guide helps all of you out in some way. Now, before we get down into business, this guide will also be put on my Patreon very soon, so if you guys are supporting over there, feel free to look out for it. You might learn something as well. And without further ado, let's get right into the action. The first tip that I can ever give all of you guys, and I'll be giving you 5 tips for this. The first tip, being firm but flexible. Now, for whatever reason, people that think that the best tip to being a good dungeon master is to always say yes to your players. The truth is not that simple. In fact, the truth is actually quite the contrary. The hardest part of being a dungeon master is learning when to say yes and also when to say no to your players. The rule of cool is an amazing example of this ideal for dungeon mastery. I'm not trying to say never let your players have their cool moments, but let them come with some challenge and risk of failure. For example, if the monk in the party wants to surf down the crumbling castle walls after the wizards and fighters have unleashed some unforeseen circumstance leading to their deaths, leads to the crumbling of the walls, let the monk surf down. However, have him roll some acrobatics or athletics checks, usually acrobatics in this case, to maintain his balance or be crushed by the debris. There's a lot of good examples I can give with this, and having that action moment can be really fun in the circumstances, as long as it's not a campaign-shattering event. And that's something a lot of players have a lot of trouble realizing, is they want to do something cool, but they almost do it within breaking the boundaries of the campaign, so you gotta be aware of that. The second tip I can give you is to improvise, and don't over prepare. This tip is more for the newer DMs out there, especially. For whatever reason, a lot of newer DMs have trouble improvising and will prepare weeks, like upwards of a week to 2 weeks for one session. This is something you don't want to do. For a lot of newer DMs, I suggest using pre-made adventures to help you get into the swing of things and finding your style. And if you're playing with experienced players, if some of your players at the table are very experienced, you'll learn the hard way that you need to improvise. The reason I say improvisation is no matter what you have planned, you can have the most amazing adventure planned, but if your players don't latch onto it, you have to find some way to drag them into it. And that's the problem that over preparation has, is you need to find a hook, and you're just always chomping at the bit for a hook to get your party members to do what you want. There are a couple ways to do this, however, and I will explain those later on, because there's quite a few of them. One of which I'll explain right now, actually. One way to get party members to do whatever you want them to do is steal something. It works every time, and it can be as over the top as you want or as subtle as you want it to be. The main reason I advise against stealing things from players is, yes, it can lead them to do wonderful adventures, lead them into wonderful things, but you can only do it once per campaign, and you don't want to abuse this. Do not abuse it, because your players will catch on really quickly, and they're not going to like you because of it. What I'm trying to say is, if you do steal something, usually steal something that they really shouldn't have. Like, for example, let's say you pull a bit of a Monty Hall DM and you give the party a bunch of rare magical items and they're at level 5. Well, that'd be something to try to steal from the players. For example, you could steal, let's say you give them a +3 mithril longsword, and the party members aren't using it yet because they're still trying to figure out what to do with it. Well, let's say they leave their wagon outside. Let's say they for example, just got done raiding a temple to a god lost to time. Found a bunch of chests with money, magical weapons that they probably shouldn't have had, all sorts of things. Well, whenever they go to their tavern, they just throw a tarp over their wagon, have no one watch it, had that wagon mysteriously vanish. They hear a commotion coming from outside. And even if they did put someone watching it, they could have had, a lower level magic user cast sleep on the guards, or whatever that was guarding it. Yeah, it's always possible. If anything, if they put someone to watch the caravan, it actually makes it harder to steal, but it also makes it worth it. A good example of this came from Noah Antweiler or Spoonie, and this is something I've actually picked up myself without realizing it. And same thing with my dad. Um, the party's nearing the tundra. They're going to rest for the night. And they put the guy with the lowest perception score, the fighter, in this case, on watch for the night. He fails his spot check, and goblins sneak into the camp and steal everyone's boots. Steal everyone's boots, and they steal some pelts. They just, they're looking for things that are warm, so they're stealing whatever they perceive as warm. The party wakes up, and almost all of them notice that their boots are missing. This could put them in a dilemma. It's where they're like, what do we do, guys? We go back into town and buy more boots? Well, one of the party members is gonna say this. No, those motherfuckers are wearing our goddamn boots. We gotta find them. Well, as a dungeon master, you can do one of two things: they're not wearing the boots, or to make it more hilarious, these little goblins are indeed wearing your boots, and you just follow the trail to them. It gets even funnier when they actually get into the tundra and it's snowy and stuff. In terms of, you can say, guys, it's getting really cold. You guys are going to get frostbite on your feet. What are you going to do? Nah, man, we got bear skins. We're going to wrap bear skins around our feet, DM. You can say, okay. Sure enough, you can do a number of things. You can have them go into the Tomb of Horrors, but people might see that coming. Another interesting thing you can do is have the goblins sneak into an orc stronghold and are holding up in one of the towers. And let's say they're bugbears or hobgoblins, for example, that are wearing the rest of the party members' boots. Well, this comes into the fact that they had to sneak in through an orc stronghold, a place that lower level party members really shouldn't be, and they had to find a way to deal with the orcs to get their boots, to deal with the hobgoblins and bugbears to get their boots. It gets really interesting and rather fun really quickly. Keep in mind, CR is another thing that can come into play with improvisation. A lot of DMs look at CR as more like a video game, like, okay, you need to fight this monster to get this much experience, and yada yada yada. You should usually fight them in this order. Actually, it's not that simple. Half the challenge with implementing challenge rating is, like, just don't even look at the CR. Just don't look at it. Look at where the party is currently, and look at the monsters that would fit that location. For most settings on the open, you're more likely to find things like bandits, orcs, goblins, more mundane monsters. Now, by the contrary, if you're in the Feywild, you're finding a lot of weird things like hags, red caps, etc. More monsters that represent extremes of emotion. So for most cases, you're dealing with things that throw a lot of charms out, or in the case of the red caps, the little crazy bastards are usually coming like, you never find just one red cap. You usually find like upwards of 12. Wherever there's one red cap, there's always a shitload more. And the most deadly thing, a lot of people think that, oh, they're just going to use their sickle. No, they're going to charge you and kick you to death. If anything, if you're dealing with red caps, look up in the air. Look at everywhere, not the ground. Because those motherfuckers will jump down and just stomp you to pieces. Tip number 3, this is more or less if you do like planning a story. There's a saying, sandbox on rails, where it has the perception of open world, but there's always a grand story. This is usually how I DM. Sandbox with rails. For the most part, I'm very fond of open world campaigns entirely, which are rather fun to begin with. In fact, it's more realistic for most players, because the whole goal is for them to forge their story, and as a dungeon master, it's the easiest one to DM, because the players can shape their own destinies. And you can shape the campaign around those actions, which can be pretty fun. Another thing I want to add on top of this, if you do DM evil campaigns, and if you are play evil characters, myself included, I tend to play evil characters a lot more than most. But I know how to make them work in most groups, and usually the answer to that is playing lawful evil. And letting your party know ahead of time, look guys, I'm playing lawful evil. I'm not going to do anything against you because there's bigger fish to fry, which oftentimes there is. In fact, if anything, lawful evil can fill a number of roles simultaneously, can actually exist within a party of good characters, because they're the least evil. My main advice to Dungeon Masters and most players, don't play evil alignments. It usually doesn't end very well, because most people don't know how to play them. But for DMs, I don't recommend ever DMing an evil campaign because the problem is there's no lifespan on it. It can be as long or short as it wants to be. And you just kind of have to let it flow naturally. Now, on the contrary, I'm not going to say never let your players play evil alignments. That's something Adventurers League does, and I'm not quite fond of. What I am saying is make sure if your players are more experienced, then you can argue them being able to play evil alignments a lot more effectively than the newer players who tend to stray straight towards. For the most part, newer players and most players in Dungeons and Dragons are quite chaotic neutral, which is annoying because it's the most played alignment for whatever reason, and I've never quite understood that. It's another thing. If you are DMing, you have the say in what your alignments are and what they do. Not to say that, oh, you have to be lawful good if you're a paladin. No, that died out years ago for a couple good reasons. But if you are a paladin, most of the time you're going to end up lawful unless you're an Oath of the Ancients paladin. Your Oath of Devotion is your stereotypical and traditional lawful good paladin. For several reasons. They're very much the archetypical paladin of yore. If you don't believe me, just look at the tenets of the devotion, and you'll pretty much see why. Oath of the Ancients, however, very much chaotic good, or chaotic neutral with good tendencies. They're very much embodying nature. In fact, you can have a lawful Oath of the Ancients paladin that just follows the law of nature. But back on point with improvisation, if you over-prepare for something, A, that's a mark of a new dungeon master, but B, a mark of an extremely railroaded campaign. Now, some DMs, their style is more of the narrative-driven campaign, and that's perfectly fine. But keep in mind, a lot of those DMs really are more on RP, and I love RP. It's a wonderful thing for storytelling, but sometimes you have to include combat, and if you go by rules as written and rules as intended, combat is the only way to gain experience. And a lot of people think that, oh, you should gain experience for role-playing. It depends. If you can work your way around a fight entirely against something you shouldn't have been fighting, yes, certainly I'll give you experience for that. But I find that giving players experience for role-playing only works for those who are a bit adhered to the concept of having to get into character and roleplay. That's great. For most role players, I had to encourage them to do combat, which is a little bit annoying. Combat in Dungeons & Dragons is one of the main staples of the game, and it's a large part of it. And for players that aren't interested in combat, well, they're more likely there for the story, which is one reason why you're there anyway, aside from the social interaction. But not everyone likes combat, not everyone likes RP. I'm kind of the mix. I'm, in many ways in this boat myself, I'm a combat gamer first, role player second. But improvisation comes in handy because you can throw a number of encounters at the party, and you can lead to a really cool moment. Because if you improvise and keep something going in your head and knowing, okay, there's 3 orcs here. What normally comes to the orcs? 4 orcs, usually. Now, with goblins, on the other hand, it's more easy to improvise larger encounters, especially if you're dealing with a dragon. A lot of people fail to realize this with D&D, especially, but like if you're dealing with a large monster, with epic monsters like liches, for example. What's one thing liches have? Lots and lots of undead. You may not fight all of them at the lich, but minions can come in to distract you from killing the big bad in 2 hits. Which is especially true if you have an assassination rogue in the party or an evocation wizard. Keep in mind, those 2 classes are examples of classes that deal a lot of damage really quickly, but they have problems sustaining it. Assassination rogue is great if there's a lot of targets that haven't acted yet, and they can really take advantage of that critical hit with their sneak. Evocation wizard has Sculpt spell and does a lot of burst damage on demand. However, when the fight lasts longer than that initial burst window, you're going to see a lot of other classes like Sorcerer and Warlock really succeeding in sustained damage. And Fighter especially. Now, third tip, encounter design. Most of it is improvised. However, the main thing is that's the main thing you plan in Dungeons & Dragons. That maybe takes like 5-10 minutes. And keep in mind, you'll be seeing that a lot of, the more experienced you are as a Dungeon Master, the less time you have to plan. I usually plan for about 10 5 to 10 minutes per hour of the session, which is usually, it leads up to maybe about an hour at most. Keep in mind, I never plan any of the RP parts. I let the players do that, and I improvise when necessary. I never plan any of the dialogue for characters because I feel like their dialogue should be natural and on the fly. So most people are improvisational speakers, whether they realize it or not. Most people don't literally read off a script every time they meet someone. Most people are very random. People are random by nature. Now, aside from this, what's one thing we can learn as a dungeon master that can carry over to our experience as a player? Um, Knowing when to let the DM do his thing. Don't butt in. Don't correct the dungeon master because the dungeon master has the final say. And it's mainly just the courtesy. There's a wonderful little thing in this game called the social contract that gets into the fourth and fifth reasons of how to be a good DM, is understanding the social contract. The social contract is an unwritten thing, and if you want to learn more about this, I suggest checking out Seth Skorkowski's channel on YouTube, where he talks about the social contract in a lot more depth. I digress, and I will be linking that video in the description below. But the social contract is an unwritten agreement where the players agree to show up, and if they can't make it, they will agree to let the dungeon master know, and it's mainly just an unspoken vow, essentially. Where you don't be a dick. You're not going to be intentionally hassling the dungeon master. And that's something I've seen a lot that happens to women that are dungeon masters. They'll get bullied by the players, especially to giving them more matchable items. And it doesn't really happen as much to male DMs for whatever reason. If you do see this, and any of you have dungeon masters that are women, or are lady dungeon masters yourself, don't let your players push you over, because that's just the mark of terrible asshole players. If they're trying to bully you into magic items, don't tell them yes, because they will keep bullying you. If anything, tell them no, and tell them what you expect them to do to get those items. Let's say if like a level 1 character is bullying you into giving them a legendary item, don't cave into that. Don't be afraid to tell them no, I'm not going to give you a legendary item at level 1 that'll make you the most effective tank. No, you're sticking with your starting equipment, and maybe you'll find a matchable item later on. Maybe not. Maybe you'll find this legendary item. Maybe not. It all depends. Legendary items are more effective if you give them as like later quest rewards, and especially if you have a party member that wants to craft a legendary sword that's worthy of whatever god they follow. Well, that's an interesting story event that you can have later on once they get sufficiently more skilled with whatever profession they have. Again, understanding the social contract and not breaking it yourself as a dungeon master. Another important thing, again, it kind of goes back to the sandbox on rails. Always have, like, if you do like the narrative of your campaign, your players like the narrative, always have something tied into the narrative wherever they go. Now, there's obviously some restrictions to this, especially if the party are elves and are in their main elven city. They may not find anything relating to the narrative in the dwarven city. However, this also comes down to player perception and if they're willing to look for that. A great example really comes down to the players and knowing and making interesting characters that have goals. I can't stress this enough as a dungeon master and as a player myself. Always have a goal in mind for your character. It can be something like, let's look at Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride. He has a goal that's very typical of that of an archetypical Dungeons and Dragons character. He wants to find the six-fingered man and avenge his father's death. Okay, something that's oddly specific yet hard to find. That's wonderful for a D&D goal. In fact, that's actually, you can make a character that's an Inigo Montoya right off the bat, to where whenever the party goes to a new town, the character that's playing Inigo Montoya will say, I will go to the tavern and ask anyone if they've seen sightings of the six-fingered man. And hell, you can have one of the monsters they're fighting, let's say a Minotaur, for example. Probably not a Minotaur, but let's just say some monster drops a hint about the six-fingered man's location. Well, this leads into a very wonderful thing to where the character playing Inigo has a couple interesting moments where they can lead to great role-playing. One of which being, well, do they tell the party about the six-fingered man? Or do they not? Until later. It makes them drop everything and go pursue that lead, even if it leads to, nothing. I think the best goal when it comes to, and again, that's a very good goal to have. And another thing, encourage your players to roleplay. That's a very wonderful thing, especially for newer players that are very new to the hobby and aren't into the role-playing as much. Try to encourage them. One of the things that my friend Curse of Insanity does a lot is the very interesting way of working inspiration. Take a vote from the players and ask them what their favorite moments of the session were, and if they all tie back to one player's idea in particular, well, you can give them the option of taking an inspiration token or 100 experience points, which is great at lower levels, 100 experience points, but a lot of people like the inspiration a lot more. Keep in mind how inspiration works, and basically it works like this. If they don't use it by the end of the next session, it's gone. But they have a lot of things to keep in mind with it, because you gotta keep in mind there's usually only like one inspiration token per game. And that just comes into DM style, like whether or not you give inspiration. I personally don't, because I find it's kind of worthless. Especially if you got players that are very, very creative. Which oftentimes new players are very creative. And it's kind of refreshing to see the ideas they have, which a lot of them are cool. And again, that mostly comes to knowing your players. This is more important if you're DMing in person and around a tabletop. Play with your friends. And keep in mind, there are some friends that you just don't play Dungeons and Dragons with. There are friends that you do. The best way to look at stuff like that is just know your friends. If you have a lot of nerdy friends that you play Dungeons and Dragons with, well, play Dungeons and Dragons with them. This mostly comes down to, again, the main tip of being a DM is knowing what kind of DM you are. Are you a Dungeon Master out of necessity, much like myself? Or are you DMing because you like to DM? A lot of times, most Dungeon Masters arise out of necessity instead of being full-time. However, there are those that just start off as Dungeon Masters. The best thing to do as a DM, regardless, have your screen nearby. I've got mine right here. And have usually notes. Always have notes as a Dungeon Master and always take notes. One of the things that I do, and you'll see right here with my notes, hopefully, is I have the party's passive perception. I have trap DCs and trap DCs and relative experience points, as well as the party's armor class and passive perception scores, as well as concentration, usually highlighted because I oftentimes forget it, which is odd considering I'm a spellcaster. Aside from that, there's a number of other things you can do. And this mostly comes down to, if a party member has a cool idea, do not browbeat it to the ground unless it's insanely stupid and campaign breaking. But if they have a great idea that's actually really good for the setting and really good for that instant, it goes back to the rule of pool. You can certainly try. The main thing with being a dungeon master is don't intentionally kill the players. Do not intentionally kill the players, because people will pick up on that really quick and they're going to feel a sense of hostility and resentment. Now, the best thing I can give you is look at campaigns like Ravenloft and Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu is a bad example for this, but Ravenloft's a great one. The whole point of Ravenloft is it's a grimdark setting, and the point is you're basically driving the players insane over the course of a shorter campaign. Ravenloft is in the Demiplane of Dread, and what's the main thing about the Demiplane of Dread is it's a very evil place. So if you have a party of good characters, you can essentially use their alignment against them, especially true if they're lawful good. Not as much so if they're chaotic good, but more so if they're lawful good, especially. You can have a number of quests set up by even the leaders of those planes. But for the most part, you'd be setting it up just through dialogue, and just through NPC dialogue and a number of things. Using the party's alignment against them is one of the most effective tools to being a dungeon master. and it's something a lot of people fail to realize. And you learn this by playing evil characters, how to use alignments against people that are playing them, because they're essentially using one of that character's stance on morality and stance and cosmic stance and the conflict of good and evil against them to further one or more things. You can further the ideals of good as well as the ideals of evil. And in second edition, paladins were very susceptible to having dungeon masters use their alignments against them. Now, what does this mean exactly? On the cosmic stage, the purpose of the dungeon master is not to kill the players outright, because what's a story with that character with having constant party wipe after party wipe? No. If the party members do have something coming, which quite oftentimes they do, or they outright ask for it, well, you have no choice as the dungeon master. You have to kill that character. There are ways, and I usually am more for killing characters off for the purpose of promoting the story and establishing wonderful role playing. Killing characters can be an immensely powerful role playing scenario, especially in traditional fantasy, where that character's name can become a rallying cry for any number of party members. There's a lot of wonderful things you can do as a dungeon master, and that mainly comes down to knowing your players, knowing how they think, what they would do, and using improvisation, but also critical thinking to think ahead of the players. Because if you're an evil, devious dungeon master, it's all about thinking ahead of the players and knowing, okay, if I do this, then I can get a good reaction out of them. Potentially shaping an entire adventure just from this one thing happening. For example, the knight that could be the big bad evil guy that's connected to one of the characters. That guy comes in. Well, that changes everything. Much like the six-fingered man with Inigo Montoya. When that guy makes his appearance, that changes everything for the rest of the game. Because that's a mission of, I gotta find this guy and kill him. It may take months, it may take years in game. But it's worth it in the end, because that's giving that guy the closure he needs. And one of the main goals that every DM has is having a recurring villain. However, I usually find this works better for chicken shit characters, things that, would have like a ring of teleporting or a ring of gaseous form, because of course they would. Look at Prince Humperdinck as an example of this. He's a chicken shit. He's gonna run away. Even the six-fingered man is gonna run away when it best suits him. Cowardly villains are often the best ones for long term. However, if the party has your villain on the ropes, they have him on the ropes. You can't stop that. So sometimes, and it's very hard for most teams when they have a recurring character, when to let it go. And that's why cowardly villains work the best for recurring villains. Or wizards. Wizards are great recurring villains, especially in the case of Vecna, one of the most prominent villains in Dungeons & Dragons, up there with Strahd. They're both wizards. They're both powerful. It's gonna be harder to kill them because they're very cunning. They have the power. They have the wisdom of the ages, essentially. Dragons are another great recurring villain, especially because they also are very powerful beings. And this video is getting closer to 30 minutes. I'll be making another one on this soon. Remember, guys, please support me on Patreon if you wish to. And if you want, feel free to visit my Patreon as well. I also do some writing for Nerdarchy, so feel free to check some of those out. I'm working on another one as we speak for the Wizard, which I have a video guide up for as well. And as always, stay nerdy.